What would you do if the man you trusted most
I'm not for
turned his
sale,
back
Mr.
on you
Caldwell.
right at the moment you needed him? Most Clara Jennings was smart, diligent, and full of quiet dreams when she worked as a
I don't need your
secretary
money.
in a powerful logistics empire. But one fateful night
Oh my
with
gosh.
her cold, untouchable CEO,
There are 3
Richard
heartbeats.
Caldwell,
Congratulations.
changed everything. When Clara discovered she was pregnant,
And there
Richard's
are the
response wasn't
heartbeats,
compassion,
strong and
it was
clear. You're
humiliation.
having triplets.
He fired her,
Triplets! Oh my
had her
God.
escorted out like a criminal, and tried to erase her from his world. Yet life had other plans. Clara wasn't just carrying one child. She was carrying 3. How does a single mother, abandoned and penniless, rise from the shadows to build a company that would one day eclipse the very empire that cast her aside? How does she face the man who once dismissed her when destiny brings her back stronger, wealthier, and holding all the power? And most of all, what happens when 3 innocent boys look
I'm not
into
for
Richard's
sale,
eyes,
Mr. Caldwell.
eyes identical to their own, and ask the question he cannot escape. Are you our daddy? Stay with us and discover the story of betrayal, resilience, and triumph. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe because you won't want to miss what comes next. Chicago, 2017. The city's skyline glowed with the last light of evening. Glass towers
I don't need your
shimmering
money.
against a backdrop of purple clouds. Inside the 40-story headquarters of Caldwell Global Logistics, Clara Jennings smoothed her blouse with a steadying hand. At 27, she had worked here for 3 years, first as an administrative assistant and later as executive secretary to the CEO. Her diligence had earned
Oh
her
my
respect,
gosh.
at least from those who valued competence over pedigree.
There are 3 heartbeats.
Clara
Congratulations.
came from Springfield, Illinois, the daughter of a retired postal worker and a mother who had passed too soon. Her strength was quiet, grounded, the kind that carried her through college nights balancing 2 part-time jobs while finishing her degree. She was not flashy, not the type of woman who turned heads at parties, but she was sharp,
And
dependable,
there are the heartbeats,
and possessed an
strong and
understated
clear.
grace
You're
that
having
made people
triplets.
trust her.
Triplets!
Her
Oh my
boss,
God.
Richard Caldwell, was another story. At 38, Richard was a third-generation heir to the Caldwell empire, polished, tall, with piercing gray eyes and an aura of command. He seemed carved from the very stone of Chicago's granite facades. His suits were Tom Ford, his watch a Patek Philippe, and his smile, when he offered it, was calculated for effect. Employees admired him from a distance, but up close, his charisma masked a chill, an arrogance that slipped out in dismissive remarks, or a glance that lingered just long enough to remind you of your place. That December evening, at the company's year-end gala, Clara had felt the first crack in her professional armor. The champagne flowed. The ballroom at the Drake Hotel glittered with laughter and soft jazz, and Richard, so often remote, had drawn her into a dance. He had leaned in, whispered words that sounded warmer than the December lights. And, for once, she allowed herself to forget the gulf between them. Hours later, in the hush of his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, she surrendered to a night she had never imagined. But passion, Clara would learn, was fleeting in Richard Caldwell's world. As 6 weeks later, with a trembling hand, she stared at the 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test in her apartment bathroom, fear and wonder twisted together inside her. She carried life now, a life that bore Richard's features, his legacy. She told herself she owed him honesty. Maybe, just maybe, he would understand. The next morning, she requested a private meeting. By afternoon, she stood outside his office on the top floor of Caldwell Tower, a sealed envelope in her purse containing the test result. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she stepped through the mahogany doors. Richard did not look up immediately. He was reviewing contracts, pen scratching across the page with brisk authority. 5 minutes. Jennings, he said without warmth. I'm pressed for time. Clara's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. Richard, I'm pregnant. The child is yours. For a moment, silence. The hum of the HVAC system seemed deafening. Then, Richard lifted his gaze. His expression shifted, not shock, not tenderness, but something colder. Disgust. You can't be serious, he said, his voice low, clipped. This is impossible. A secretary carrying my child? Do you realize what that would do to me, to this company? Her knees felt weak, but she held her ground. I'm not asking for charity. I just thought you deserved to know. Richard's jaw tightened. He opened a desk drawer, pulled out a checkbook, and with quick, precise strokes, wrote out a figure, $50,000. He slid the check across the desk as though discarding a receipt. This should cover it. Handle it quietly, or disappear. Either way, this inconvenience will not touch my life. Clara stared at the slip of paper as though it were poison. I don't want your money, she whispered, voice breaking. His gray eyes hardened. Then you want trouble. That I cannot allow. He pressed the intercom. Janet, call security and have HR prepare the termination paperwork. Her breath caught. Termination. Richard Mr. Caldwell, he corrected, his tone slicing the air. You attempted to manipulate a superior for personal gain. This is over? The next half hour blurred. She was ushered into the HR conference room, a dozen executives avoiding her eyes as Richard announced her dismissal for unethical behavior. His words painted her as a seductress, a schemer, lies spoken with confidence, swallowed without question. When she protested, her voice cracked with desperation. Richard leaned close, whispering where only she could hear. Go back to where you came from. Jennings. People like you will never belong in my world. Security arrived. 2 guards flanked her, impassive, while a cardboard box filled with her belongings framed diploma. A desk plant. A photo of her late mother was pushed across the table. Signed to acknowledge your final paycheck, the HR director said, voice mechanical. Clara's hand shook as she signed, her dignity bleeding with every stroke. She carried the box through the open office, past colleagues who turned away, who whispered, who pretended not to see. The elevator ride down felt like a free fall, each ding another nail sealing her humiliation. On the sidewalk outside Caldwell Tower, the cold January wind cut through her coat. Tourists bustled past. Executives hurried by without a glance. Clara clutched the box against her chest, the pregnancy test still hidden in her purse, and wondered how her life could collapse in less than an hour. She walked with no destination, the city lights blurring through tears. Her mind swirled rage at Richard's cruelty, fear for the child within her, shame at the stares of strangers. By the time she reached her small apartment, her legs ached, her spirit hollow. She set the box down, pulled out the sealed envelope, and stared again at the test result. Positive. Proof of both her deepest humiliation and the fragile spark of hope she could not yet extinguish. Alone, with no hand to hold, she whispered to the life growing inside her, "We'll survive this. Somehow." The winter wind rattled against the thin window panes of Clara's apartment that night, a far cry from the gleaming glass walls of Caldwell Tower. She set the cardboard box of office belongings on the counter, staring at it as though it contained not papers and a plant, but the wreckage of her life. The space she called home was small, a 1-bedroom walk-up on the north side of Chicago. The carpet bore stains from tenants past. The heat clanked unevenly through old radiators, and the kitchen faucet dripped steadily into a stainless steel sink. Rent consumed most of her paycheck. Now, without income, even that would soon be in jeopardy. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, pulling her knees to her chest. She reached into her purse and held the pregnancy test again, its pink lines defying denial. The reality pressed down on her, unemployed, alone, carrying a child, conceived in a moment that now felt like betrayal. The next morning, she dressed carefully for a task she dreaded, a thick scarf, her only pair of decent shoes, black pumps whose heels were scuffed from years of use. She rode the bus to a free clinic 3 neighborhoods away, where linoleum floors and the faint scent of antiseptic carried memories of childhood checkups. When the technician confirmed the result, "You're pregnant, Miss Jennings." About 7 weeks along, Clara forced a smile, but when she asked for an ultrasound appointment, her hands trembled as she signed the forms. That evening, back at her apartment, reality seeped into every corner. She opened the refrigerator, half a carton of milk, some wilted lettuce, leftover spaghetti in a plastic container. She made a list of groceries, eggs, bread, fruit, then stared at her bank balance online. $73.19. The next day, she walked the aisles of a discount grocery store, comparing unit prices, calculating every cent. She chose store-brand cereal over Kellogg's, ground beef instead of chicken breasts, apples bruised but still edible. At checkout, she slid crumpled bills across the counter, her cheeks burning as she prayed she wouldn't go over the total. Life became a rhythm of survival. Heat bills stacked on the counter, envelopes marked final notice. She hand-washed her clothes in the bathtub to save on laundry. Each night, she slipped off her shoes, feet aching, soles worn nearly through. The pumps that had once clicked confidently across marble floors now whispered of decline. And yet, within her, life grew. Clara placed her hand on her stomach often, whispering to the unseen child. Fear gnawed at her, but so did a flicker of resolve. Still, she believed Richard deserved to know. She sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, typing and retyping the words. Richard, I wanted to inform you that I am pregnant. The child is yours. Regardless of what happened between us, I believe you should be aware. Clara. Her finger hovered over send. She swallowed hard, then clicked. For 2 days. She checked her inbox constantly. No reply. By the end of the week, she understood silence was his answer. The night the email went unanswered, Clara cried quietly into her pillow. The fear spilled into questions that circled endlessly. Could she provide enough? Would she be a good mother? How could she raise a child when her own father had struggled to raise her alone after her mother died? At her next clinic visit, the ultrasound technician smiled kindly as she adjusted the gel on Clara's stomach. The monitor flickered to life. Clara turned her head, bracing for the image of a single bean-sized shape. The technician frowned, then adjusted again. Well, she murmured, you're carrying 3. Clara blinked. 3 triplets, the technician confirmed, pointing to the screen. 3 tiny flickers, 3 heartbeats, steady and insistent. The room seemed to spin. Clara gripped the table for balance, laughter and tears rising together. Triplets, not 1 child, but 3. She walked home in a daze, the cold wind biting her cheeks. Her mind reeled rent already beyond reach, food barely affordable, her shoes worn to threads. And now, 3 mouths to feed, 3 cribs, 3 futures depending on her alone. In the quiet of her apartment, Clara curled on the couch, hands wrapped around her belly. Fear clawed at her, whispering of failure, but beneath it, stronger. A voice steadier than her own spoke through the beating of 3 hearts inside her. You are not alone. They are with you now, and you will find a way. That night, she made a vow aloud, her voice soft but resolute. I don't care how hard this gets. I will not disappear. I will not let anyone decide our worth. We will survive, and one day, we will rise. The radiator hissed, the faucet dripped, the city roared outside. But in that moment, Clara Jennings felt a fire kindle in her chest, a flame that no humiliation, no rejection, not even Richard Caldwell's cruelty could extinguish. The weeks that followed felt like walking through fog, each day heavier than the last. Clara's pregnancy was officially classified as high risk. Carrying 3 lives inside her frame was a burden that no amount of determination could make easy. Her doctor, a middle-aged woman with kind but firm eyes, reminded her at every appointment, "You need rest. Miss Jennings. More rest than you can imagine." Rest, however, was a luxury Clara could not afford. Her insurance plan, the only thing standing between her and financial ruin, demanded steady employment. So Clara kept working. At sunrise, she buttoned herself into a faded diner uniform, feet already aching as she tied the apron around her waist. The place smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon, and every shift stretched endlessly. By afternoon, her ankles swelled, and she leaned against the counter to take pressure off her back. Some customers were kind. A trucker once slipped a $20 bill under his plate, whispering, "For the babies." Others were less so, snapping at her if she moved too slowly or spilled water with trembling hands. Clara bit her tongue, swallowed her pride, and kept moving. Every dollar mattered. At night, after the bus ride home, she logged onto her old laptop. Data entry jobs filled the hours until midnight. The glow of the screen blurred her vision, but she typed on, her swollen belly pressing against the desk. When exhaustion finally overtook her, she lay down with the knowledge that in 4 or 5 hours she would rise and repeat the cycle. Bills piled on the kitchen counter like storm clouds. Rent, utilities, medical co-pays. Each envelope she opened felt like a blade. To buy prenatal vitamins, she sold her mother's necklace, her last physical tie, to the woman who had once been her anchor. The pawnshop clerk barely glanced at it before handing her cash that felt like betrayal. By the 7th month, her doctor grew stern. "Clara, you cannot keep this up. Your body is at the limit." "I don't have a choice," Clara whispered, voice frayed but steady. The choice, however, was made for her when labor came early. It was a cold April night when the first contraction struck, sharp, unyielding. She dropped the dish she was washing, water splashing across the floor, and gripped the counter until her knuckles whitened. Another wave followed, and panic surged. The ambulance ride blurred into flashing lights and muffled voices. At the hospital, bright lamps blinded her as masked doctors and nurses rushed in and out. Machines beeped. Monitors tracked 3 tiny heartbeats struggling to stay steady. Clara clung to the sound, terrified of silence. Hours of pain followed an endurance she hadn't thought possible. And then, at last, the cries, not 1, but 3, weak, fragile, yet defiantly alive. "Ethan," she whispered when the nurse showed her the first. "Samuel." She named the second, voice breaking, and for the smallest one, whose cry was barely more than a whimper, she whispered, "Daniel." They were whisked away into the neonatal intensive care unit, their tiny bodies enclosed in incubators, wires taped to fragile skin. Clara caught only glimpses Ethan's clenched fist, Samuel's restless kicks, Daniel's solemn stillness. But even in those brief seconds, she knew these children were her reason to keep breathing. When the nurse finally left her alone, Clara lay in the hospital bed, body broken, spirit trembling. Tears streaked her cheeks as she whispered to the ceiling, "To God, to anyone listening, please let them live." The next morning, she shuffled to the NICU, gown hanging loose, hair uncombed. She pressed her hand to the glass of the incubators, marveling at the impossibility before her. 3 sons, so small, yet already carrying her whole world in their chests. The joy, however, collided quickly with harsh reality. The bills came almost immediately: hospital charges, NICU fees, medication, follow-up visits. Even with insurance, the numbers soared beyond comprehension. Clara sold more: her television, her mother's rocking chair, half the clothes in her closet. Every sacrifice was a calculation, what could be given up so that her sons could stay another day in the incubator. Nurses spoke gently to her, but Clara saw their pity. She was the young mother who lingered too long at the NICU window, who scribbled figures on scraps of paper, whose shoes had holes in the soles. Yet, when she touched the glass, watching Ethan's chest rise, Samuel's tiny fingers curl, Daniel's lips tremble as if in dream, Clara felt a strength no one else could measure. Exhaustion settled deep in her bones. Nights were endless alarms sounding, feedings every 2 hours, her body still healing from surgery. She would sit in the rocking chair she borrowed from a neighbor, one baby on her chest, 2 in bassinets beside her, and hum lullabies she barely remembered from childhood. Fear whispered constantly, "How will you pay for formula? What if you can't keep the apartment? What if they grow up hungry, ridiculed, abandoned like you? but over fear. Another voice rose firm, unyielding. You are their mother. No one can decide their worth but you. One afternoon, after selling her laptop just to cover part of the medical balance, Clara walked back into the NICU carrying only a spiral notebook and pen. She sat beside the incubators, jotting notes ideas for work she might do from home, schedules for feedings, long-term plans she couldn't yet afford but refused to stop imagining. She placed her hand flat on the glass. Daniel's tiny palm twitched against hers. The connection jolted her heart. No one, she whispered, will ever decide what you are worth. Not Richard Caldwell. Not this world. No one but me. Her voice shook, but in the reflection of the incubator glass, her eyes gleamed with fire. Clara Jennings was exhausted, broke, alone, but with 3 fragile lives depending on her, she was also unbreakable. The Jennings apartment was never silent. At all hours, a chorus of cries, giggles, and babbling filled the cramped one-bedroom that Clara now shared with her 3 sons. The space had been transformed into a nursery, office, and survival bunker, all in one. 3 second-hand cribs lined the living room wall, squeezed so tightly together that Clara had to shuffle sideways to reach each child. A playpen, stacked laundry, and boxes of donated clothes filled whatever gaps remained. By dawn, Clara was already moving. She rose from the couch, her makeshift bed since the babies had claimed the bedroom, and slipped into her diner uniform. The mirror by the door reflected tired eyes ringed with shadows. But Clara smoothed her hair and tied her apron anyway. She kissed each tiny forehead before handing the boys over to Mrs. Parker, the elderly neighbor who watched them in exchange for groceries and the occasional $20 bill. At the diner, Clara balanced trays of coffee and plates of pancakes for truckers and the college kids. Her feet ached by the second hour, but she kept her smile steady, writing orders on her notepad with quick precision. She had learned to push through the exhaustion, telling herself each tip was another pack of diapers, another can of formula. When she left in the afternoon, she carried home not just her earnings, but the lingering smell of grease that clung to her uniform. Evenings were for the boys. Ethan was the loudest, his voice carrying across the apartment as he babbled commands to his brothers. Samuel, more deliberate, inspected every toy, turning blocks in his hands as if calculating their geometry. Daniel sat quietly, often clutching a blanket, his blue-gray eyes studying Clara with a stillness that unnerved her. It was the same calm intensity Richard once carried. Clara's routine was a rhythm of necessity, feedings, diapers, baths in the chipped porcelain tub, rocking all 3 to sleep before she sat down at the folding table that doubled as her desk. There, she powered up her battered old laptop, its screen flickering with age. From 8 to midnight, she worked online data entry jobs, her fingers moving mechanically through spreadsheets. The pay was meager, but it kept the lights on. Midnight to 2 was reserved for tutoring, helping high school students across the country with essays via video calls. She muted her mic whenever a baby stirred, apologizing with a smile when a client heard crying in the background. When the house was finally quiet, Clara allowed herself an hour. She opened a folder buried deep in her laptop, Logistics Optimization Draft. It was code she had started back at Caldwell Global Logistics. Her idea for streamlining delivery routes with predictive algorithms. At the time, Richard had dismissed her suggestion with a laugh. Secretaries don't solve problems like that, he had said. But Clara had never deleted the files. Now, staring at the lines of code, her exhaustion melted into focus. She adjusted formulas, scribbled notes, dreamed of a system that could save millions in wasted fuel and labor. The irony struck her once she had been told she didn't belong in Richard's world. Now, in the dim light of her tiny apartment, she was building her own. Her sons' personalities became her compass. Ethan's boldness reminded her to take risks. Samuel's constant questions pushed her to refine her logic. Daniel's quiet gaze told her to trust her instincts even when doubt gnawed at her. Late one night, Clara sat with Daniel on her lap, his head tucked beneath her chin. She whispered into his curls, "They said I couldn't belong, but we'll prove them wrong, not for revenge, but for us. For a life where you never have to wonder if you're enough." The laptop whirred, old but loyal, as though agreeing with her. Life was far from glamorous. Clara's shoes wore thinner, the soles patched with duct tape. Meals were simple peanut butter sandwiches, canned soup, eggs stretched across several dinners. On cold nights, she wrapped the boys in layers of donated blankets when the heat sputtered out. Yet, through the struggle, there was light. Small moments glowed like embers. Ethan's triumphant laugh when he stacked 3 blocks. Samuel's delighted gasp at discovering the word moon in a picture book. Daniel's tiny hand curling around Clara's finger while she coded late at night. Every challenge etched itself into Clara's spirit. Every bill, every sleepless night, every sideways glance from strangers whispering too young, too many, too alone, only carved her determination deeper. Her life was reduced to inches cribs pressed against the wall, notebooks stacked on the floor, groceries measured in coupons. But in her heart, she carried miles, miles of roadmaps, miles of algorithms, miles of dreams that stretched far beyond the narrow apartment walls. Clara Jennings was not simply surviving. She was quietly, stubbornly, building. And though the world did not yet know it, in that tiny Chicago apartment, among the cries of 3 children and the hum of an old laptop, the seeds of a billion-dollar empire had begun to take root. On a drizzly Thursday evening, Clara bundled her 3 sons into second-hand jackets and loaded them into a double stroller with a makeshift board attached for the 3rd. The boys were nearly 2 now, bursting with restless energy, but tonight she needed them to stay close. She was heading downtown for something she couldn't afford to miss, a local startup meetup hosted at a co-working space near the Loop. The fluorescent lights of the shared office buzzed faintly as Clara entered. Around her, young men in crisp button-downs and women in tailored blazers clustered in circles, laughing over cans of craft beer. Slideshows glowed on screens, showcasing slick prototypes and ambitious visions. Clara pushed the stroller into the corner, her uniform still smelling faintly of diner grease, her hair tied back in a bun that had survived a long shift. She felt the eyes immediately, some curious, some dismissive, a few openly disapproving. A single mother with 3 toddlers was not the kind of disruptive innovator this crowd expected. Still, Clara straightened her shoulders, walked to the sign-in desk, and scribbled her name, Clara Jennings. Founder, Logistics Optimization Project. The boys fidgeted in their seats. Ethan pointed at the projection screen, babbling as though giving his own presentation. Samuel tugged at Clara's sleeve, whispering questions about the vending machine by the wall. Daniel, as always, sat quietly, his wide eyes tracking every movement in the room. When it was her turn to pitch, Clara's palms grew damp. She stepped up to the small stage, laptop in hand, and pulled up slides she had cobbled together late at night. The projector flickered, and her voice trembled at first. "My name is Clara Jennings. I've been developing a logistics platform that uses predictive algorithms to cut fuel costs and streamline delivery routes. Companies lose millions each year to inefficiencies that we can solve." She spoke quickly, perhaps too quickly, but passion steadied her as she described the system she had coded in scraps of time between diaper changes and double shifts. Her voice grew firmer. She outlined case studies, potential savings, scalability. But when she finished, the silence was telling. A man in the back smirked. "Looks like you've been reading white papers. You actually coded this yourself." Clara nodded, lifting her chin. "Yes, every line." Another man leaned to his friend, whispering loudly enough for her to hear. "Ambitious for a waitress." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks, but before she could respond, a woman's voice cut through. "I'd like to see more." The speaker was tall, mid-30s, with auburn hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple black dress, understated but commanding. She introduced herself Laura Mitchell, angel investor, former software engineer. Laura approached Clara after the event, ignoring the curious stares. "Your code, do you have it running anywhere?" Clara opened her old laptop. The screen cracked at the corner. She showed Laura the prototype interface, clunky, unpolished, but functional. Real-time maps lit the screen, routes shifting as new data was entered. Laura watched, silent. Then finally said, "You've done this with what resources?" Clara hesitated. "This laptop, free cloud credits, and every hour after my kids fall asleep." Laura glanced at the stroller, where Ethan was now singing softly to Samuel while Daniel stared at the ceiling. Something softened in her expression. "You've built more with nothing than some teams do with millions." The next week, Clara met Laura at a quiet cafe. She had scrubbed her diner uniform from her clothes, put on the only blouse without stains, and prayed the boys would nap through the meeting. Laura arrived with a leather briefcase and an air of quiet decisiveness. "I won't waste your time," Laura said. "I believe in your idea. I'm prepared to invest $50,000, enough to hire a junior developer, upgrade your equipment, and give you breathing room to build." Clara nearly dropped her coffee. 50,000. The number was surreal, more than she had earned in 2 years of scraping. Laura leaned forward. "But listen carefully. This is seed money, not a gift. You will need to fight for every milestone. Investors won't care about your struggles, only your results. Can you handle that pressure?" Clara's throat tightened. Her instinct screamed to say yes, but doubt coiled inside her. What if she failed? What if she wasted someone else's faith the way Richard had dismissed hers? That night, after tucking the boys into their cribs, Clara sat at the table staring at the investment papers. Ethan stirred in his sleep, mumbling. Samuel rolled onto his side, clutching a stuffed bear. Daniel blinked awake briefly, meeting her eyes with a calm, knowing gaze. She whispered into the dim room, "What if I fail you? What if I can't give you the life you deserve?" The silence answered with the rhythm of 3 small breaths. Clara pressed her pen to the contract and signed. The first sparks had been lit, within days. She ordered a refurbished desktop with upgraded processing power, hired a freelance coder named Mark to assist with debugging, and rented a few hours a week at the co-working space downtown. She worked side by side with Mark, explaining her vision with clarity that surprised even her. Still, the fear lingered. Every keystroke carried the weight of Laura's faith, the weight of her son's futures. She lay awake at night, doubts gnawing, am I clever enough, strong enough, or am I just chasing smoke? But every morning, when 3 pairs of eyes looked up at her with trust, untainted by the world's cruelty, Clara found her courage. She whispered the same vow again and again. "I won't let them decide our worth, not Richard, not anyone. We'll make our own place." And so, with a cracked laptop, a new investor, and 3 toddlers as her constant witnesses, Clara Jennings stepped from survival into creation. The new desktop computer arrived in a dented cardboard box, its fan already humming louder than it should. But to Clara, it felt like luxury. She set it up on the folding table in her apartment, next to the boys' playpen, wires snaking across the floor. The glow of its screen was a promise, the chance to build something that mattered. Nights became Clara's true battlefield. She waited until the boys were asleep. Ethan sprawled diagonally across his crib, Samuel clutching his bear with military precision. Daniel curled quietly, his thumb near his lips. Only then did she sit at the desk, headset on, connecting with Mark over video calls. "Your code is solid," Mark admitted one evening, eyes heavy behind his glasses. "But it's patchwork. You're holding this together with duct tape." Clara smirked, typing furiously. "Duct tape holds better than you think." They laughed, the kind of laughter that made fatigue bearable. But as soon as Ethan stirred, Clara muted herself, lifted him into her lap, and kept coding with one arm. More than once, she juggled debugging a line while rocking Daniel with her foot. It wasn't efficient, but it was survival. The days blurred into each other, shifts at the diner, tutoring, late-night code. The bills still outpaced her earnings. Clara maxed out a credit card to pay for server space. She borrowed a few thousand from a small business microloan program, her signature shaky on the forms. Debt hung over her like storm clouds. At the co-working space, she overheard whispers. That's the single mom with 3 kids, someone muttered. No way she can scale. Another snickered. Her idea's not new. The big players will crush her. Clara kept her gaze forward. Though her cheeks burned, she had learned not to waste energy fighting words. Instead, she fought in code, in lines of algorithms that grew sharper each week. Laura became more than an investor. She checked in weekly, sometimes with spreadsheets and hard questions, other times with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic ear. You need to think bigger, Laura said one night as they sat in the corner of the co-working space. Pilot projects, proof of concept. Companies won't care about your story unless it saves them money. Clara nodded, scribbling notes. She was grateful for Laura's bluntness. It was the kind of honesty Richard had weaponized. But Laura delivered it with belief, not contempt. The breakthrough came quietly. A regional courier company agreed to test her software on a trial basis. Clara sat at her desk, heart pounding, watching as delivery routes updated in real time. Fuel savings ticked upward, idle time decreased. Numbers she had only imagined were now on a client's screen. Mark sent a late-night message. Congrats, boss. We're live. Clara leaned back, tears welling. In the playpen, the boys stirred, their tiny breaths filling the room. She whispered to them, "We did it. Maybe just a small step. But we did it." Of course, the world wasn't suddenly kind. The loan collectors still called. Clara dodged past due notices, scraping by with a mixture of tips, tutoring paychecks, and the occasional extension from understanding landlords. She wore the same pair of shoes until the soles flapped, repaired twice with glue. But the software worked. Word spread quietly. Drivers liked the interface. Managers liked the savings. By the end of the quarter, she had 2 more small clients. At the next meetup, Clara presented results. Our pilot company saved 12% on fuel costs in 3 months. That's 6 figures back in their pocket. This time, the room didn't laugh. Some still looked skeptical, but others leaned forward, taking notes. Afterward, Laura pulled her aside. You've proven the concept. Now you need to protect it. File patents, draft contracts. This isn't just a project anymore. It's a company. Clara swallowed, nerves tightening. A company. The word felt both enormous and fragile, like porcelain in her hands. She thought of the nights coding with a baby on her lap. The grocery bills barely paid, the humiliating smirks. And then she thought of Ethan's fearless grin, Samuel's endless questions, Daniel's quiet gaze that seemed to say, "Keep going, Mama." On the walk home, stroller bumping against cracks in the sidewalk, Clara whispered, "It's not just about surviving anymore. We're building." And for the first time since her world had collapsed outside Caldwell Tower, she believed it. 3 years passed like a blur of sleepless nights, endless code, and the chaos of raising triplets. By the time Clara Jennings turned 32, her tiny apartment operation had transformed into Loginex Solutions, a legitimate company with paying clients, contracts, and a small team working out of a rented office space in downtown Chicago. The software had matured far beyond its rough prototype days, with predictive routing, real-time traffic integration, and data-driven scheduling. Loginext was saving mid-sized shipping companies millions each quarter. Drivers praised it. Managers swore by it. And slowly, the wider world began to notice. It started with a short feature in a local business journal, From Waitress to Founder, Single Mom of Triplets Disrupts Logistics Industry. The article included a picture of Clara at her desk, 3 laptops open around her, the boys' toys scattered in the background. The headline embarrassed her, but it also opened doors. Soon, other outlets picked up the story. The startup mom, Chicago's mother of innovation. For the first time, Clara was invited to speak publicly, not to defend her right to exist, but to share her vision. The invitation came from a regional technology conference in Milwaukee. Nothing glamorous, just a few hundred attendees. But for Clara, it was monumental. She had spent years working in the shadows. Now, she would step into the light. the night before the event. She paced her modest living room, practicing aloud. Ethan sprawled on the rug, stacking blocks into tall towers. Samuel sat cross-legged with a notepad, copying down words he didn't understand. Daniel watched quietly from the couch, eyes thoughtful, as if he understood the weight pressing on his mother's shoulders. Clara's voice cracked on the same line every time I was told once that people like me didn't belong in the world of innovation. Tonight, I'm here to prove that the world is wide enough for all of us. Her hands trembled, her chest tightened. What if I freeze? She whispered. Ethan looked up from his tower, grinning. Mama, you never freeze. You're like fire, Samuel added. If you get nervous, just explain it like you do to me. I understand. Right. Daniel said nothing, but his gaze, calm and unwavering, seemed to hold her together. The next day, they drove to Milwaukee in Laura's SUV. Laura had insisted on accompanying her, both as advisor and friend. The boys sat in the back, chattering about the hotel pool and the promise of pancakes for breakfast. Clara clutched her notes, heart pounding. The conference venue was modest, a renovated warehouse turned event space. Rows of chairs faced a small stage with a projector screen. Banners fluttered Midwest Tech Innovators 2023. Clara sat backstage, palms sweating, trying to focus on her breathing. The sound of the audience shuffling into their seats echoed like waves in her ears. Laura squeezed her hand. You've already done the hard part. Clara, this is just telling the truth. When her name was announced, Clara walked onto the stage, blinded by the lights. The microphone seemed impossibly tall, the room impossibly large. She scanned the front row, and there they were. Ethan waved enthusiastically. Samuel sat upright with his notepad ready. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. The fear loosened its grip. She began softly, her voice unsteady. 3 years ago, I was working late nights at a diner and coding by the light of a secondhand laptop while my 3 sons slept beside me. I didn't look like the typical founder, and truthfully, I wasn't. She paused, hearing the hush in the room. No laughter, no whispers, just listening. I was told more than once that people like me didn't belong in this industry, but I knew inefficiency was costing companies millions. I believed that technology could solve it, and I refused to let anyone else define my worth or my children's future. Her voice grew stronger as she clicked through slides, real case studies, graphs showing fuel savings, quotes from satisfied clients. By the time she reached the conclusion, her hands no longer shook. She looked directly at the audience. Logime? Next Solutions isn't just about logistics. It's about proving that innovation comes from everywhere. Sometimes from the most unexpected places, like a single mother coding at midnight while rocking a baby back to sleep. The room erupted in applause. Clara blinked, momentarily stunned. Then she smiled, not the forced smile she had worn for years at the diner, but a genuine one, born of hard-won pride. Backstage, Laura hugged her tightly. You killed it. This is just the beginning. But it was the boys who gave her the truest validation. Ethan leapt into her arms, shouting, Mama, you were awesome. Samuel presented his notepad, where he had written in shaky letters, You belong. Daniel simply wrapped his arms around her waist, silent but sure, his blue-gray eyes reflecting the strength she had finally found in herself. For the first time in years, Clara walked into the night air not as a survivor, but as a leader. The breakthrough had come not just for her company, but for her soul. By the 4th year of Next Solutions, the whispers had turned into headlines. Venture capital firms that once ignored Clara now chased her, eager to be part of her company's meteoric rise. It wasn't easy, no fundraising round ever was. Clara flew to San Francisco twice in a single month, sometimes leaving the boys with Laura or Mrs. Parker, sometimes dragging them along with coloring books and tablets to keep them occupied in glossy conference rooms. She endured skeptical questions from men in expensive suits who asked more about her childcare arrangements than her technology. But Clara no longer shrank from those moments. She answered with quiet authority, her voice steady, her numbers airtight. And then, one morning, it happened. The Series A round closed at $200 million. The company's valuation soared to nearly $800 million. Clara sat in her office, no longer a cramped co-working cubicle, but a glass-walled space overlooking Chicago's skyline, staring at the signed documents. For a long while, she said nothing. Mark popped champagne in the background. Laura squeezed her shoulder. The team cheered, but Clara's eyes blurred with tears, her mind flickering back to a very different office. 5 years earlier, when Richard Caldwell had ordered security to escort her out like trash, she whispered to herself, almost inaudible, "We belong." The success allowed Clara to do something she had dreamed of for years, buy a home for her sons. Not just an apartment, not just somewhere temporary, but a real home where roots could grow. She chose Denver. The city's tech scene was blooming, its mountains a daily reminder of resilience. The move also gave her boys clean air, space to run, and a fresh start away from the shadow of Chicago's past. The house sat on a quiet street in a leafy neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion Clara refused to drown in excess, but it was spacious enough for comfort. White clapboard siding, wide porch, a small garden in the back. Inside, sunlight streamed through large windows onto polished wood floors. For the first time, each boy had his own room. Ethan's was filled with sports posters and a basketball hoop nailed above the closet door. Samuel lined his shelves with books, meticulously organizing them by subject. Daniel's walls were painted deep blue, a telescope by the window, his drawings pinned neatly in rows. Clara's room was simple, just a bed, a desk, and a worn armchair by the window where she liked to read. She didn't buy designer clothes or jewelry. Most mornings, she still drank instant coffee in a chipped mug, the same one she had used back in her tiny Chicago apartment. Neighbors noticed how the CEO of one of the fastest-growing startups in America still drove a used SUV, still packed her kids' lunches herself, still shopped at discount stores. Clara shrugged off the curiosity. Money wasn't the point. Stability was. One Saturday morning, the triplets raced through the backyard, chasing each other across the grass. The air smelled of pine and freshly turned soil from the small vegetable garden Clara had planted. She leaned against the porch railing, mug in hand, watching them. Their laughter carried, high and unbroken, across the fence. It was everything she had once begged for in silence, a safe place, a life where her children could be children. And yet, the past never let go entirely. Some nights, after the boys were asleep, Clara found herself back in memory, the sterile office lights. Richard's voice sharp with disdain, the heat of humiliation on her cheeks as security guards escorted her out, the look in her colleagues' eyes, some pitying, most indifferent, the way she had clutched that pregnancy test in her pocket like a secret weapon she couldn't yet wield. Even now, with $800 million attached to her name, the sting lingered. Success didn't erase scars. It only reminded her how deep they had been carved. She often wrote late-night journal entries, not for the world, but for herself. Remember the cardboard box. Remember the silence in the elevator. Remember the check they thought would erase you. Do not forget, because forgetting makes you soft, and softness is what they preyed on. Still, Clara was not bitter. She was cautious, deliberate, aware. Her boys were her anchor. Every time she looked into their faces, Ethan's fearless grin, Samuel's curious frown, Daniel's quiet intensity, she knew why she endured the storms. One evening, as she tucked Daniel into bed, he asked in his steady, thoughtful way, "Mama, why don't we live in a huge mansion like the kids at school?" Clara brushed a curl from his forehead, smiling. "Because, sweetheart, a big house doesn't make a home. What matters is who's inside it." Daniel considered this, nodded solemnly, and whispered, "I like our home." Clara kissed his head, her heart swelling. "So do I." In Denver, life was better. But Clara never forgot the lesson that had fueled her from the beginning. Her value and her children's would never again be defined by someone else's measure. And though Richard Caldwell hadn't crossed her mind in months, his shadow lingered at the edges. She knew, deep down, that fate was not finished weaving their threads together. News of Caldwell Logistics' decline first reached Clara in a late-night report from her legal team. She had been reviewing expansion plans for Loginex's Denver office when Laura forwarded the briefing with a single line. "You'll want to see this." The headline was blunt: Caldwell Logistics faces turbulence as stock plummets. Opt. 18%. Clara stared at the words, her chest tightening. Beneath the headline, the article detailed supply chain disruptions, outdated technology, and growing investor dissatisfaction. Formerly the golden child of logistics, Richard Caldwell's empire was showing cracks. For years, Clara had forced herself not to dwell on him. She had built her life forward, not backward, and yet, seeing his name tangled in the failure sent a ripple through her, part satisfaction, part unease. In boardrooms across Chicago, whispers grew louder. Caldwell's leadership was questioned. His father's old allies on the board were fractured, younger members pushing for radical change. Rumors swirled of an impending leadership shakeup. Laura's voice broke through Clara's thoughts during their next strategy session. If we want to expand aggressively, acquiring Caldwell's client base would catapult us years ahead. Their market share is still enormous, even if the ship is sinking. Clara folded her arms. "You're suggesting a takeover. I'm saying the opportunity is real," Laura replied evenly. "And you know as well as I do. Clara, no one is better positioned than you to lead that merger." The irony was suffocating. To take control of the very company that had spat her out like refuse. It was poetic justice, but it was also personal. Dangerously so. That night, Clara sat alone in her Denver study, the glow of her desk lamp spilling across legal documents. She could initiate discrete stock purchases through shell entities, slowly building a position without drawing suspicion. It was risky, expensive, ruthless. She looked out the window at the snow-dusted backyard where her boys' sleds leaned against the fence. Ethan had declared himself team captain on their last sledding race. Samuel had tracked every slope's angle with mathematical precision. Daniel had sketched the mountains in his notebook, capturing the silence in charcoal strokes. Her hand hovered over the contract. Was she doing this to build her company or to punish Richard? The memory struck hard the sterile Caldwell boardroom. Richard's cold dismissal, the humiliation of security's grip on her arm, the image of him watching impassively from the window as she stumbled out. Pregnant and alone, her pulse quickened. Part of her wanted him to feel what she had felt, to see everything he thought untouchable crumble beneath someone he once dismissed as just a secretary. But another voice whispered back, "Revenge doesn't build, it consumes." She pressed her palms together, whispering aloud, "This isn't about him, it's about us, about proving to my sons that we define our value." And yet, the two truths sat side by side. Impossible to separate the hunger for justice and the need for affirmation. The next morning, she called Laura and the legal team. "Begin purchases," she said, quietly, through proxies. "I want no headlines until we're ready." Over the following months, Clara lived a double existence. By day, she expanded Loginex's operations, meeting with partners, celebrating milestones. By night, she reviewed stock acquisition reports, signatures from obscure holding companies stacking neatly in encrypted folders. Each percent gained felt like a step toward inevitability. Meanwhile, Caldwell Logistics spiraled further. Internal memos leaked missed delivery targets, abandoned innovation projects, executives jumping ship. Richard appeared in public less and less. When he did, his once confident smile seemed strained, his tailored suits hanging looser, shadows under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. The financial press speculated endlessly. Is Caldwell Logistics too big to fail? CEO Richard Caldwell. Silent amid crisis? Clara clipped the articles but never displayed them. She stored them in a folder labeled Only Archive, as though reminding herself not to indulge in gloating. Still, late at night, when her sons were asleep, she would reread the lines, not with joy, but with a strange ache, a recognition that no victory could erase the hurt of that day. One evening, Daniel padded softly into her study, clutching his sketchpad. "Mama, why are you always awake so late?" Clara smiled, pulling him into her lap. "Because I'm working on something important." "Important for us?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "For us." He studied her face with the same quiet intensity that always unnerved her. Then he whispered, "Don't let it make you sad." Clara kissed his hair, swallowing hard. "I'll try." The deal moved steadily, share by share. Clara's hidden hand tightened around Caldwell Logistics. The board didn't see it yet. Richard didn't see it yet. But soon, they would. And Clara knew when that day came, she would have to face the question she had been avoiding. Was this truly about building a better future, or about finally settling the score with the man who once discarded her? For now, she allowed herself only one certainty. The shadows of her past were no longer chasing her. She was walking straight into them, eyes wide open. The National Technology Forum in New York was one of the biggest events of the year. Industry titans, investors, and innovators filled the gleaming glass halls of the convention center, eager to glimpse the future of logistics, AI, and supply chains. For Clara Jennings, the invitation to deliver the keynote address felt like the culmination of years of relentless work. She had spoken at smaller conferences before, but this was different. This was the stage where narratives were written and legacies cemented. The morning of the event, she stood in her hotel suite overlooking the Hudson River, fastening the simple gold necklace she always wore. It was her one keepsake from her mother, a quiet reminder of her roots. Her crimson blazer, tailored but not ostentatious, caught the early light, reflecting her own transformation, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. The boys were with her, of course. Ethan darted between rooms, tie half-fastened, declaring himself Clara's bodyguard. Samuel double-checked the schedule, making sure he knew when they could explore the American Museum of Natural History. Daniel stood by the window, staring quietly at the city skyline, sketchpad in hand. Laura tapped at the door, tablet in hand. "You're on at 10 sharp. Panelists go after lunch, and Clara..." She hesitated, her voice softening. "Richard Caldwell is here." Clara froze, the name slicing through the air. For years, he had been a shadow haunting her thoughts, fueling her resolve. Now, flesh and blood, he was just floors away. "I thought he'd avoid a stage like this," Clara murmured. Laura shook her head. "Desperation makes people bold." The knowledge settled heavy in Clara's chest. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would say, how she would look him in the eye without flinching. But imagination and reality rarely aligned. By the time she stepped onto the stage, her resolve was tested. The hall stretched endlessly, rows of faces watching. The lights were blinding, the cameras recording every breath. Clara gripped the podium, inhaled deeply, and began. 5 years ago, I was coding at a kitchen table in a one-bedroom apartment, raising 3 infants while working 2 jobs. No one thought I belonged in this industry. But I believed inefficiency could be solved, and I refused to let circumstances define me. Today, Loginex Solutions serves clients across the nation, saving billions in wasted resources and emissions. Her voice grew stronger with each slide. Graphs of cost reductions, maps of optimized routes, testimonials from clients who had nearly gone bankrupt before her software stabilized them. She ended not with statistics, but with conviction. Innovation doesn't belong to the privileged few. It belongs to anyone willing to build, to endure, to rise. The applause thundered, echoing off the steel and glass. Clara bowed her head slightly, then exited backstage, heart hammering. And then she saw him, Richard Caldwell. He stood near the panelist lounge, older but unmistakable. His once polished confidence was dulled, his face more lined, his frame thinner in his tailored suit. Yet his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, were the same. They locked on hers, freezing both in place. The years collapsed in an instant, the sterile boardroom, his cold dismissal, the humiliation of being escorted out. Clara's fists clenched, but she held her gaze steady. She was no longer the woman who had walked out of Caldwell Tower in shame. Richard was the first to move. He approached slowly, disbelief etched into every step. Clara Jennings. His voice faltered on her name, as though saying it dredged up ghosts he'd buried. She inclined her head coolly. Mr. Caldwell, you're the CEO of Loggy Next. His voice was hushed, incredulous. The company everyone's been talking about, Clara's lips curved faintly. Apparently so. Before Richard could respond, Ethan barreled toward her, Samuel and Daniel close behind. Mama, can we go to the museum now? Ethan tugged at her hand, his blazer slightly crooked. Richard's eyes widened, his gaze snapping to the boys. The color drained from his face. 3 children, nearly identical. Same caramel skin, same blue-gray eyes. His eyes. Clara felt the weight of the moment press down. For years, she had imagined his recognition, the shock of seeing himself multiplied by 3. Now it unfolded in silence so thick it drowned the bustling noise of the convention. Richard's lips parted, but no words came. He looked from Ethan's confident grin to Samuel's analytical frown, to Daniel's quiet, piercing gaze, and back to Clara. 5 years, he whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking. They're mine. Clara's expression didn't waver. They are my sons. What you do with that truth is your choice. The boys tugged at her, oblivious to the tension. Samuel adjusted his glasses, asking, Mama, is that someone important? Clara's reply was steady, each syllable deliberate. Not anymore. She turned, guiding her children down the hall. Richard stood frozen, watching the life he had once discarded walk away, not just Clara, but the 3 living testaments to choices he had made, choices that had finally come back to confront him. After New York, the days blurred into a storm of unanswered calls, unread emails, and messages Clara deleted without opening. Richard Caldwell was trying desperately to reach her. At first, the attempts were formal, a short note from his assistant, Mr. Caldwell requests a private meeting to discuss potential collaboration. Clara ignored it. Then came direct calls, his name flashing across her phone screen late at night. She let them ring until they died in silence. Finally, the tone shifted. A voicemail left in Richard's own strained voice. Clara, please, I know I can't undo the past, but we need to talk. About the boys, about the company, about everything. Clara closed her eyes, thumb hovering over delete. Before pressing it, she would not allow his voice back into her home. Instead, she poured herself into the acquisition plan. Each evening, after tucking her sons into bed, she sat in her Denver study with Laura and the legal team, reviewing purchase orders and proxy filings. Piece by piece, the shares of Caldwell Logistics slid quietly into her control. Her hands sometimes trembled as she signed. She remembered vividly what it felt like to be powerless, to have her future dictated by his cold words. Now, the pen in her hand rewrote that story, one signature at a time. But, for Richard, the silence was unbearable. In his Chicago penthouse, he paced endlessly, whiskey glass forgotten on the counter. His reflection in the window looked hollow, older than his 40 years. For decades, he had been the golden heir, the man with the answers, the authority, the charm. Now, that sheen was cracking. The board was restless. Investors were panicked, and rumors of his incompetence spread like wildfire. He had dismissed Clara once as a distraction, a liability to be erased. Now she stood on stages he once commanded, her name spoken with respect, her company hailed as the future, and she had 3 sons, his son's living proof of a life he had turned away from. He replayed the moment in New York again and again, Clara's calm defiance. The children's eyes, his eyes staring back at him. The weight of his choices pressed down like a millstone. At board meetings, he forced composure. We're restructuring, that's all. Market turbulence is temporary. But the charts behind him told another story: declining revenue, eroding market share, client defections. One board member leaned forward, voice sharp. What about the rumors? Richard. What about Logie? Next. The press says they're circling us like vultures. Richard's chest tightened. Speculation, he said curtly. They're too small to swallow a company our size. But deep down, he knew better. Loginext wasn't small anymore, and Clara was no longer the woman he could dismiss with a signature. The media seized on the story like blood in the water. Is Caldwell Logistics the next domino to fall? Blared a headline in the Financial Chronicle. Another piece in TechWire went further. Sources suggest Logie. Next Solutions is positioning for a hostile acquisition of Caldwell Logistics. Stock tickers flashed the speculation, sending Caldwell shares into turbulence. Analysts debated on television. If Jennings pulls this off, it would be the most poetic turnaround in corporate history. Clara read the articles with a calm mask, but her stomach churned. She had planned for secrecy until the last moment. The leaks meant the clock was ticking faster. She couldn't afford hesitation. Still, in the quiet of her nights, doubt crept in. Was she taking the company because it was strategically sound, or because it was his? Would her sons one day see her as visionary or vindictive? One evening, Samuel padded into her study, rubbing his eyes. Mama, why are you always working on papers with the name Caldwell? Clara froze. Because it's part of our business now. He tilted his head, curious. Is Caldwell bad? Clara's throat tightened. Not bad, just a reminder. Some things in life, you don't run from, you face them. Samuel seemed satisfied, nodding before curling into her lap and drifting back to sleep. Clara kissed his hair, whispering, I'm facing it for you. Meanwhile, Richard felt the walls closing in. Each headline cut deeper. Each board meeting turned frostier. Shareholders whispered about forced resignations. He tried to rally his allies, but his words carried less weight than before. The empire he had inherited was slipping through his fingers, and the person tightening the noose was the woman he had discarded 5 years earlier. At midnight, staring at his phone, he typed a message he never sent Clara. I was wrong about everything. Don't take them from me. Instead, he poured another drink and stared at the city skyline, the Caldwell logo glowing faintly in the distance. For the first time in his charmed life, Richard Caldwell understood fear not of markets, not of competition, but of facing a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The silent war was no longer silent. The world was watching. The marble lobby of Caldwell Logistics felt strangely smaller than Clara remembered. Once, its gleaming walls had towered over her like a judgment, the cold stares of executives burning into her back as security escorted her out. Now, she returned through the same revolving doors, not as an employee, not as a secretary, but as the majority shareholder. Her heels clicked evenly against the polished floor, echoing through the silence as receptionists scrambled to announce her arrival. Behind her, Laura walked briskly with a folder of documents tucked beneath her arm. 2 attorneys followed, their briefcases heavy with contracts and proof. And just a step behind, walking in perfect synchronicity, were the 3 boys who carried her, Future in his face. Ethan's blazer was slightly crooked, his tie tugged loose in rebellion. Samuel adjusted his glasses, clutching a notebook where he had been scribbling questions about how big companies work. Daniel walked quietly, his gaze steady, observant, the very image of Richard Caldwell at 5 years old. When the elevator opened on the executive floor, Clara knelt briefly, straightening Daniel's collar. "Remember what I told you," she whispered. We walk in with our heads high. We don't need to be loud to be strong. The boardroom doors loomed ahead, tall and imposing. Laura pushed them open, and Clara stepped through first, her sons at her side. The room froze. 14 board members sat around a long mahogany table. At the head was Richard, mid-sentence in what appeared to be a desperate attempt at reassurance. His words died instantly as his eyes locked on Clara. The board members turned too, their gazes moving from Clara to the 3 boys who trailed her. The resemblance was undeniable. The same blue-gray eyes, the same sharp jawlines. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Richard's face drained of color, his knuckles whitened on the armrest of his chair. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice thin. Clara's expression remained calm, composed. She set her briefcase on the table, opened it, and slid a stack of documents toward the chairman. "This, gentlemen and ladies, is a business meeting. I trust you won't mind the presence of my children," they insisted on seeing where decisions about their legacy are made. The words hung in the air, deliberate and cutting. Legacy. Walter Harrington, the elder statesman of the board, adjusted his glasses and flipped through the folder. His brows rose as he scanned the contents. These filings show Loginex Solutions has acquired 52% of Caldwell Logistics through intermediaries. He looked up slowly, eyes sharp. "Is this accurate?" "It is," Clara replied evenly. "As of this morning, I control a majority stake in Caldwell Logistics. Effective immediately, I am exercising my right to restructure the executive leadership and board representation." A stunned silence followed. One board member leaned back in his chair, whistling low under his breath. Another began jotting frantic notes. Richard pushed to his feet, his voice rising with desperation. "This is outrageous. This is a hostile coup. You can't just..." Clara's eyes cut to him, calm but unyielding. "Can't just..." "What?" "Richard, buy your company on the open market. Build something stronger than what you squandered. Face the consequences of decisions you made 5 years ago." His jaw clenched. "This is personal." "Everything in business is personal," Clara countered. "But this isn't about revenge. It's about leadership. Caldwell Logistics has been bleeding for years under your neglect. Clients are leaving, stockholders are panicking, and the world is watching. You had your chance. Now, it's mine." At that moment, Ethan tugged on Clara's sleeve, whispering a little too loudly, "Mama, that man looks just like Daniel." The room erupted in whispers. Every board member glanced at the boys again, their eyes widening as realization dawned. Clara rested a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder, never breaking her composure. Children do say the funniest things. But the truth was plain. No DNA test was needed. The bloodline stood in triplicate at the end of the table. Richard's face crumbled, fury warring with panic. "You've ambushed me?" "No." "Richard," Clara said softly, "you ambushed yourself 5 years ago when you chose arrogance over decency. I simply learned to play the game you thought I could never enter." Walter Harrington cleared his throat, commanding attention. "The documents are in order. Legally, Miss Jennings is within her rights. As majority shareholder, she has authority here. Unless anyone objects, no one did." Not a single voice rose in Richard's defense. Clara straightened, her voice steady. "Effective immediately. I will assume executive control as chairwoman. Richard Caldwell will step down as CEO and retain a non-executive board seat, at the discretion of the shareholders." Her attorney slid copies of the resolution across the table, the shuffle of papers filling the heavy silence. Richard collapsed back into his chair, eyes fixed on the boys. For the first time in his charmed, privileged life, he looked powerless. Samuel raised his hand timidly. "Mama, is this where the important people work?" Clara bent to meet his gaze, her voice gentle. "Yes, sweetheart. But never forget, important doesn't mean better. Important is what you choose to do with what you have." The boy nodded solemnly, as though committing the lesson to memory. Clara rose again, her gaze sweeping the room. Gentlemen and ladies, Caldwell Logistics is no longer in crisis. It has a future, and it begins now. The board members, sensing history unfolding, nodded in quiet assent. The tide had turned. Richard Caldwell sat in silence, staring at the empire he had once commanded, now claimed by the woman he had tried to erase and by the three sons whose eyes mirrored his own. For a moment, the Caldwell boardroom sat in silence, the shuffle of papers and hum of the air vents the only sounds. Then, as if on cue, the triplets slipped from their seats and wandered toward the head of the table, their small shoes tapping lightly against the polished floor. Richard's eyes widened in alarm, his hand gripping the edge of the table as if bracing against a blow. Ethan, bold as ever, was the first to speak. He tilted his head, studying Richard with open curiosity. "Mama, he looks like Daniel." Samuel, more precise, adjusted his glasses. "No, he looks like all of us." "Exactly." And then Daniel, quiet and contemplative, asked the question that cut through the air like a blade. "Are you our daddy?" The words rang through the room, shattering the professional veneer like glass. Gasps echoed from board members. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, riveted. Richard's face turned ashen. His lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time in his polished career, he was stripped bare before his colleagues, not the confident CEO, not the heir to a dynasty, but a man confronted by truth he had spent years burying. His voice cracked. He swallowed, tried again, but nothing coherent followed. His hand trembled as he ran it through his hair, eyes darting between the three boys who stared back at him with mirrored blue-gray eyes. The resemblance was undeniable. There was no hiding it, not here, not ever again. Clara rose from her seat, her composure unshaken. "Children," she said gently, motioning them back. "Go sit with Aunt Laura for now." They obeyed, though not before Ethan whispered loudly enough for the room to hear. He didn't answer. The boardroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Richard slumped in his chair, face in his hands. Clara took a breath, then turned her gaze to the board. "Since the question has been raised, let me present the facts." Her voice was steady, measured every syllable deliberate. She nodded to her attorney, who handed folders down the length of the table. Inside, "You will find copies of emails I sent 5 years ago to Mr. Caldwell, informing him of my pregnancy. Not one was answered. Pages flipped, eyes scanning, whispers rising." Clara continued, "You will also find certified birth certificates for Ethan, Samuel, and Daniel Jennings. Each lists Richard Caldwell as their biological father." Richard flinched as though struck, but Clara pressed on. "Additionally, enclosed are the results of a court-verified paternity test, conducted independently. The genetic match is conclusive." The board members pored over the documents, murmurs swelling into incredulous voices. Walter Harrington cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. These appear authentic. "Are you confirming, Mr. Caldwell, that Miss Jennings' children are yours?" All eyes turned to Richard. His shoulders slumped, his mouth working soundlessly. Finally, his voice emerged, hoarse. "Yes." The single word hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. The board reacted instantly. One woman covered her mouth in shock. Another muttered, "My God." A man at the far end scribbled furious notes, already calculating the public fallout. Richard leaned forward, his face a mixture of despair and fury. "Clara, you've blindsided me. You didn't have to do this here, like this." Clara's eyes locked on his, calm and unwavering. 5 years ago, Richard, I stood in this very building with proof of my pregnancy. I asked for acknowledgement, for decency. You gave me a check and an escort out the door." Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of years of silence. "You had your chance to address this privately. You chose erasure. Today, I chose the truth." Richard pounded a fist against the table, startling even himself. "Do you have any idea what this does to me? To my reputation, Clara's lips curved in a faint, cold smile. Your reputation was never my responsibility. Your children were... Gasps rippled through the room again. Richard sat back heavily, his fury collapsing into something more fragile shame. His chest heaved as he glanced once more at the boys, who were now scribbling with crayons Laura had handed them, oblivious to the storm their innocent question had unleashed. Clara's attorney spoke next, his tone clinical. As majority shareholder, Miss Jennings has acted entirely within her rights in today's proceedings. The personal history between her and Mr. Caldwell is regrettable but irrelevant to the legality of her ownership. The evidence regarding paternity is provided only to clarify the matter raised. But for Clara, it wasn't irrelevant. This wasn't only about business, it was about rewriting the narrative forced upon her. She faced the board again, her tone soft but resolute. For years, I was told I did not belong, that my children were an inconvenience, that our worth could be measured by a check. Today, I stand not for revenge, but for truth. My sons will never again be invisible. Silence followed, not hostile, not doubtful, awed. The balance of power had shifted completely. Richard Caldwell, once untouchable, sat unraveling in the very room he had ruled. Clara Jennings, once cast out in humiliation, stood at the head of the table with calm authority, her son's laughter drifting faintly in the background. The truth was exposed, and it could never be buried again. The storm broke within hours. By the time Clara's plane left Chicago, the headlines were already everywhere. Single mother, CEO, ousts Caldwell. Jennings takes control of logistics giant. Triplets at the table. The untold story of Clara Jennings. Every major outlet ran the story, splashing her face across homepages and television screens. Photos of her in the boardroom circulated online, her crimson blazer sharp against the mahogany table, her sons at her side. Richard Caldwell slumped in defeat just a few feet away. Forbes called within 2 days. The feature arrived a month later, The Woman Who Rewrote the Rules. On the glossy cover, Clara sat at her Denver office desk, the triplets perched around her like a constellation. Ethan grinning boldly, Samuel looking studious with his glasses, Daniel resting a hand gently on her arm. The article traced her journey from waitress shifts and overdue bills to billion-dollar valuations and a corporate empire. But what captured readers wasn't just the triumph, it was the grit. Clara Jennings is proof, the writer concluded, that resilience is more powerful than privilege. She became, almost overnight, a symbol. Women's groups invited her to speak. Business schools dissected her strategy. Older women, mothers and grandmothers, wrote letters. You remind me of myself, only braver. I wish I'd had your courage when I was your age. Clara accepted the attention with grace, though privately she struggled with its weight. To her, success had never been about magazine covers or talk shows. It had been about survival, and now, survival had grown into something larger legacy. Richard Caldwell, meanwhile, was living his own aftermath. At the next shareholder meeting, the board voted unanimously to remove him as CEO. He was allowed a ceremonial seat on the board, a gesture of respect to the Caldwell name. Walter Harrington had said, but everyone knew the truth. His power was gone. The newspapers showed a different Richard now. Once the golden boy of logistics, he appeared thinner, his smile tighter, the confidence gone from his eyes. The press speculated endlessly. Can Caldwell recover the fall of a dynasty? Few expected he could. But while the world speculated, Clara carried her own private storm. At night, when the boys were asleep, she sat by the window of their new home, Denver's lights flickering below. She would think of Richard not the CEO, not the man who had humiliated her, but the father of her children. They asked about him sometimes, innocently. Samuel once said, "Mama, if he's our daddy, does that mean he has to read bedtime stories too?" Ethan, bolder, declared, "I don't need him. We've got you." Daniel, the quiet one, never asked. But Clara caught him staring at Richard's picture once, the one clipped from a newspaper. Those moments gnawed at her. She had promised herself that her sons would never be defined by absence. But what did that mean? Could she erase their father entirely? Or did she owe them the chance to know him, even if imperfectly? Her heart said one thing, her scars said another. Laura noticed her hesitation during one late-night strategy session. You don't owe him anything. Clara, not after what he did. Clara rubbed her temples. I know, but it's not about him anymore. It's about them. They deserve to decide, someday, if they want him in their lives. Laura leaned forward, voice softer. Then let it be on your terms, controlled, safe, but don't let guilt write the next chapter. You've earned the right to choose. Clara nodded slowly, though the weight didn't lift. Meanwhile, the media attention grew relentless. Paparazzi followed her to school drop-offs, snapping pictures of the triplets in their tiny backpacks. Analysts dissected her parenting choices alongside her business moves. She laughed at some of it, bristled at others. Through it all, she stayed grounded in routine school lunches packed neatly, late-night coding sessions to refine the software, Saturday mornings spent watching the boys play soccer in the park. She wanted her sons to know that, beyond the magazine covers and conference stages, their lives were still ordinary, still anchored by love, and yet always the shadow of Richard lingered. She imagined the moment she might allow him to see the boys, under supervision. She rehearsed what she might say. You may meet them, but you will not disrupt them. You will not wound them the way you wounded me. The thought left her conflicted. Was it strength to deny him, or strength to give him a chance? Her son's laughter often gave her the answer. They were thriving, curious, and full of life. Whatever she decided about Richard, she had already given them more than he ever had presents. One evening, after tucking them in, Clara sat alone at her desk. She pulled open the drawer and took out an envelope she had never shown anyone. Inside was the 50,000 sailor's check Richard had handed her years ago, the price he thought her children were worth. She had never cashed it. Instead, she had kept it as proof, as fuel. She studied it now. The ink faded slightly, the numbers meaningless compared to what she had built. Her company was worth billions. Her sons were priceless. Clara slipped the check back into the envelope, her decision still unresolved, but her conviction steady. She didn't need Richard Caldwell, but maybe someday her children would. The first supervised visit was set for a Saturday afternoon at a quiet family center in Denver. The neutral setting was intentional warm-colored walls, low tables with puzzles and books, staff trained to ease the tension of fractured families. Clara had insisted on every safeguard a social worker present, Laura nearby, and a schedule that limited Richard's time to exactly 2 hours. She arrived first with the triplets. Ethan darted toward the bookshelf, pulling out a comic before the introductions even began. Samuel adjusted his glasses, already eyeing the clock on the wall. Daniel lingered close to Clara, holding her hand tightly, silent as always. When Richard walked in, the room shifted. He looked smaller than the man who had once commanded entire boardrooms. His tailored suit hung a little loose, and there was hesitation in his stride. For a long moment, he simply stood at the doorway, staring at the 3 boys who carried his face. Ethan broke the silence. "You're late," he declared, with the blunt honesty of an 8-year-old. Richard blinked, startled. Yes. I'm sorry." Samuel tilted his head. "Are you nervous?" Richard gave a strained smile. "A little. Should I be?" Samuel shrugged, considering. "Depends. Do you like dinosaurs?" It was such a child's question, yet it cracked the tension. Richard's laugh was awkward, but genuine. "I used to love dinosaurs when I was your age." That was all Ethan needed to pull him toward the puzzle table. "Then help me with this T-Rex. Mama never gets the tail right." Clara stood a few feet away, watching, her arms folded. She had prepared herself for anger, for rejection, for tears. She hadn't prepared for this, an awkward, stumbling warmth creeping into the room despite the years of absence. Daniel, still at her side, finally spoke, his voice quiet. Why didn't he come before the question pierced Clara? She crouched to meet his eyes. Because sometimes adults make mistakes they don't know how to fix. Daniel frowned, unsatisfied, but didn't press. He walked slowly to the puzzle table, sitting across from Richard without a word. His silence spoke volumes. For 2 hours. Richard tried. He asked about their school, their favorite games, their friends. Ethan answered with bursts of enthusiasm, Samuel with detailed logic, Daniel with long pauses that said more than words. The boys were curious, open even, but the bond was not instant. It was fragile, tentative, unsteady ground. When the session ended, the social worker gave a polite nod. "Time's up." Ethan pouted. Already Samuel looked disappointed too, though Daniel simply pushed his chair back quietly. Richard looked stricken. He wanted to say more, to plead for more time, but Clara's presence stopped him. She held her ground, calm but firm. Outside in the parking lot, Ethan tugged on her hand. "He's okay, I guess. Not scary." Samuel chimed in, thoughtful. "He doesn't know us yet. It'll take time." Daniel was quiet until they reached the car. Then, almost too softly to hear, he said, "I don't know if I want him to be my dad." The words settled like a stone in Clara's chest. She strapped them in, kissed each forehead, and drove home in silence. That night, after the boys were asleep, Clara sat at her kitchen table with Laura. The question tumbled out of her. Raw. "Am I doing the right thing?" Laura leaned back, studying her. "What does your gut tell you?" Clara's hands twisted together. "My gut says, protect them. Shield them from disappointment, from another rejection. But part of me wonders if I don't let them try. Am I just rewriting the same mistake Richard made, deciding for them what they deserve?" Her voice broke. "Quieter now? I spent so many years making sure they'd never feel unwanted. What if letting him in just gives them another wound?" Laura reached across the table, covering Clara's hand with hers. "You can't stop them from ever being hurt. None of us can. What you can do is teach them how to face it with strength, with honesty, with you at their side. That's more than most children ever get." Clara nodded, though her heart still ached. Over the next few weeks, more visits followed, always supervised, always structured. Richard showed up on time, trying harder with each session. He brought books he remembered from his own childhood, tried to learn the boys' favorite games, even let Ethan boss him around in a board game. The boys responded differently each time. Ethan warmed fastest, quick to laugh with him. Samuel was cautious, testing him with endless questions. Daniel remained distant, his blue-gray eyes watchful, as if he were studying a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. For Clara, every visit was a test too. She saw the effort Richard made, saw glimpses of the father he might have been. But she also remembered the coldness, the humiliation, the check that had been meant to erase her children before they were born. That memory never loosened its grip. Some nights, after the boys were asleep, she stood at their bedroom doors, listening to their soft breathing, and she whispered to herself, as much a vow as a confession, "They will always know love, even if I have to guard it with my life." It was a fragile piece, this experiment in healing and boundaries, and Clara knew the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe the past did not have to dictate the future if only she could balance protection with trust, and pain with possibility. 6 months later, the name gleamed across skylines from Denver to New York, Jennings-Caldwell Group. The merger had been finalized in a storm of headlines, investor calls, and cautious applause from the industry. But as the months passed, it became clear the union was no hostile takeover. It was a rebirth. Under Clara's leadership, the company soared. Efficiency metrics broke records, client retention stabilized, and innovations poured from the research labs. What had once been Caldwell's crumbling empire was now the backbone of a global logistics revolution. The board that had once doubted her now deferred to her judgment. Forbes called her a once-in-a-generation strategist. The Wall Street Journal simply wrote, "She turned rejection into resurrection." And yet, In her office overlooking the Denver skyline, Clara never forgot. Above her desk hung a framed display. Not her first paycheck, not her Forbes cover, though both had been suggested. Instead, she had chosen a single page, blown up and preserved under glass, one of the emails she had sent Richard Caldwell 5 years ago. The subject line read simply, "We need to talk." The message body, "I'm pregnant. You deserve to know. They deserve to be known." It had gone unanswered. Now it hung as a reminder, not of bitterness, but of resolve, a symbol of how far silence had carried her, and of the world she had sworn her sons would never inherit. The company's new headquarters embodied that promise, built with glass walls and sunlit atriums. It was not just an office, it was a statement. On the ground floor was a child care center larger than some schools, with classrooms, play areas, and a garden that spilled into the courtyard. Employees' children laughed there daily, growing alongside the future their parents were building. On a late spring afternoon, Clara stood at the edge of that garden. Ethan, bold as ever, led his brothers in a game of chase, his laughter rising above the hum of city traffic. Samuel had paused to examine a line of ants crossing the path, narrating their journey with scientific fascination. Daniel lingered near a small pond, throwing pebbles and watching the ripples spread. They were 8 now, taller, their personalities blossoming more distinctly each day. And yet, when they looked up at her from the grass, the same blue-gray eyes reminded her of where they came from and of the choice she had made to carry them forward despite everything. Richard was still part of their world, though carefully. The supervised visits had become less strained. He showed up every time. He listened. He tried. Ethan bragged about him occasionally. "My dad knows all the old baseball players." Samuel tested his patience with relentless questions. Daniel still held back, though once he had quietly asked Richard for help with a math problem. Clara allowed it, but on her terms. Always measured, always mindful. She wasn't ready to forgive, not fully, but she was learning that fatherhood was no longer her battle to fight. It was theirs. As the boys played, Laura joined Clara by the railing, holding a mug of coffee. "Quite the empire," she said softly, nodding toward the building rising above them. Clara smiled faintly. Empires fall, legacies last. Laura studied her. "Do you ever regret it?" The way it all unfolded. Clara thought for a long moment. She looked at her sons, at the laughter spilling across the courtyard, at the glass tower that bore her name. She remembered the late nights of hunger, the sting of rejection, the humiliation of security guards escorting her out with a life inside her she refused to erase. "No," she said finally, "because if none of that had happened, I wouldn't be here. And they wouldn't be here." Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "The victory was never about destroying Richard. It was about proving to myself, to them, that our worth was never his to define." Laura nodded, her eyes glistening. Clara turned her gaze upward, the Colorado sky stretching wide and endless above the headquarters. She breathed deeply, letting the moment settle in her bones. "Winning isn't about knocking someone down," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "It's about building a world where your children never have to kneel in the first place." The breeze carried the sound of her son's laughter back to her. Clara Jennings, once a discarded secretary, now the leader of an empire, smiled not at what she had conquered, but at what she had created. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel not just triumph, but peace. Clara's journey reminds us that the true measure of a person's worth is never defined by others. It is discovered and proven through resilience. When life strips us of dignity, when doors close unfairly, we are faced with a choice to surrender to bitterness or to rise with quiet strength. Clara chose the harder path, working through exhaustion, raising her children with love, and building a future from nothing but determination. Her story teaches that justice doesn't always come in the form of revenge. Real victory is not in watching someone else fall, but in creating a world where those you love can stand taller than you ever could. For Clara, success was not just a billion-dollar company, It was showing her sons that their value was beyond question, that no check, no rejection could ever define their lives. For us, too, the lesson is clear even in betrayal and loss. We are never powerless. With courage, patience, and faith in our own worth, we can transform wounds into wisdom and leave behind a legacy of strength for those who come after us. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to Clara's incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Until next time, take care and keep believing in your own strength.